So we're ready. Good morning. My name is Richard Lawson. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and it's a joy to welcome all of you to the Dean's Forum, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us online as well. I'm joined by Dr. Celene Lillie, who's back with us, and I'll introduce Dr. Lillie in just a moment, but first an opening prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for this gathering and for Dr. Lillie's work and this chance to think together about the ways throughout history, within and without the New Testament, that you speak to us and call to us. Enlighten our minds this day, and finally give us a deep sense of the kind of people you call us to become. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So I'll do just a brief introduction to Dr. Lillie. Some of you will remember the introduction last week that Katie did. Celene is a lecturer in the religion department at CU Boulder. She received her PhD in 2016 from Union Seminary in New York, and she is a scholar on early New Testament texts and those texts that are outside of the New Testament as well. You lecture on a range of topics up at CU. What's your class this semester, or classes? So
this semester at CU, I am teaching a class called From Paganism to Christianity. And we start with Plato's Republic and move through Eusebius and Constantine, all in a semester. And then I teach a women in religion class, and I run that goes every semester, where we start in the ancient world to think about how do our definitions of things like women and religion, how are they created over time? And so we start in the ancient world and look at ancient myths around this as a way to kind of break up our ideas about what we think is religion is, and ask new questions. And then we go through six or seven kind of major either traditions or what I call like religiosity. So we look at indigenous traditions, we look at African American traditions, we look at Latinx traditions, etc.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive in, okay? This is our third time to have Dr. Lillie since COVID, and absolutely, I'm not supposed to pick favorite parishioners, children, or guest speakers, but she is one of them. So I'm so glad to have her. So we're just going to dive in. So here's what I remember, Dr. Lillie, about the New Testament. So I remember being taught that it takes a while for the New Testament to become the New Testament. So we don't just get Jesus, the resurrection, and the New Testament all in one fell swoop, okay? So I'm going to sketch it quickly, and I'm a little bit nervous to be doing this in front of a historian with a PhD, but let me do it quickly. Most scholars seem to think that Jesus died somewhere around 30 AD or CE. Did Dr. Lillie nod yes? Okay, good, thank you. Then you've really got a couple of hundred years before you get something that really resembles the New Testament that all of us in this room know. That is Matthew through the book of Revelation. And then you can layer on top of that what the New Testament is. Sort of remains controversial for a long time, because I was also taught that Martin Luther did not like the book of Revelation and called it a work of straw. I mean, so you've got this canon of the New Testament, and you always have opinions about it. And we as Episcopalians certainly have opinions about it too. But what I remember is that roughly when the New Testament, I was taught the New Testament sort of resembled the New Testament somewhere in the 4th century, because there's a letter of Athanasius, one of the early church bishops, where he lists the books. So if that's the case, I mean, that's 300 and something years after Jesus.
Yeah, so Athanasius, so we get this Festal letter from him, and I want to say, this is terrible, I think it's 397, it's late. And it has our first list that matches the New Testament. The first list of books that we have that kind of anywhere comes close to the New Testament is actually from Marcion, who is considered a heretic in 150. And he loved Paul. And so he just wanted Luke and Acts and Paul, and that was it. And once he came up with this list, so this is one of the new things that, which I'm fascinated by, that some folks are working on, that they think that then these groups really started making lists because they didn't like Marcion's list and they wanted more included. So then we start getting more lists of stuff. And then I believe the first person that we have in writing to talk about the 4 Gospels is Irenaeus in the 180s. And he says that, why do we need 4 Gospels? Because there are 4 winds and 4 corners of the earth. So that's why we need 4 Gospels and 4 alone.
You know, we're going to digress here just a minute, and then we're going to get back on the sort of history train. But before we do that, so I'm going to digress. Stick with me for a minute. There's something totally normal about what's in the New Testament. Like, we could go around the room and probably say, what's your book in the New Testament? What's your favorite book? What do you think should be in? You know, we've all got opinions, right? About favorite stories, favorite gospel, least favorite letter from Paul, least favorite saying from Paul. And, you know, you think about the Book of Common Prayer, it does, like, if we bury you, the Book of Common Prayer gives us selections. I mean, it's not that we're supposed to stick with for the burial. And there are like 6 Gospels that we're supposed to pick from. They're all from John. And there are actually 1 or 2 options from the book of Revelation. And it's no fire, nothing dramatic. And it's all like God will wipe away every tear from the eyes. It's the good ones, so to speak. Forgive me for that. But we're all somewhat selective in how we read and interpret. So this debate about what goes into the New Testament actually sort of resonates. I mean, we all sort of debate this internally, do we not? What resonates and what doesn't, what we like and what we don't like.
And I think, you know, to me, that's always the interesting thing about this, is that we're doing this work all the time. And I actually think, you know, there are a couple books that I really like that didn't make it into the canon. There might be a couple that I would maybe have preferred not to be there. First Timothy, again, is one of those that I just constantly think about and have been teaching on still the last couple weeks. But, you know, I think the good news about it is that once we start to realize the diversity that's actually out there in early Christian history, it's there in the canon too. And isn't that beautiful that just like, you know, songs or Shakespeare plays or movies, there are different things that resonate with us at different times. And so there's a vast treasure trove that we can draw from in these texts, whether it's tradition like the Book of Common Prayer or the New Testament, or, you know, maybe these expanded possibilities from the ancient world.
So I want to take just one more diversion, and then we're going to dive in on a major discovery in the 20th century of some new texts. So we're about to get to that. Before we do, I want to do one more diversion. So Ann Jones doesn't know that I'm going to call on her. But Ann, if you'll just stand really quickly. Ann is our librarian. Ann is the author of an amazing book on the stained glass windows that's absolutely beautiful. If you're interested, see her later on. And Ann, here's what I've been thinking about, and I didn't tell you that I was going to do this. We have, and please confirm this, in the back of the cathedral, there's one stained glass. It's the first one on the left, clerestory window on the left, first one, that's devoted to contemporary saints. And in that window is someone named Albert Schweitzer. Do you remember that window?
Yeah, the clerestory window, the first one
on the left. Yes.
We also have the cathedral, picture of the cathedral.
Exactly.
And we have Francis Florence Nightingale.
Yes. The nurse.
And the peanut roll. Yes. George Washington.
Exactly. Thank you, Ann, so much. So here's what's fascinating about Schweitzer. Schweitzer was not an Episcopalian. He was a doctor. And he became obsessed in a fabulous way with the history of Jesus. And he writes this book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus that was published in 1906. And I listened to Dr. Lillie's lecture last week, and I think that you said something last week that is actually similar to Albert Schweitzer's conclusion, but I'm curious if you agree. So here's what Schweitzer did. Schweitzer basically concluded that we can't really figure out who Jesus was historically. Like, you can't go back in time and be there with a movie camera and record everything and figure out what literally happened. We don't have that luxury of being able to go back in time. But that actually didn't bother Schweitzer at all. He thought that we still could have this transformative life in relation to the stories and presence of Jesus. So here's what Schweitzer says, and this is sort of a famous passage that some people love. A former priest that was a big influence on me loved this passage. Jesus comes to us as one unknown, without a name, as of old by the lakeside. Jesus came to those men who knew him not. Jesus speaks to us the same word, follow thou me, and sets us to the task which Jesus has to fulfill for our time. He commands, and to those who obey him, whether they be wise or simple, Jesus will reveal himself in the toils, the conflicts, the sufferings, which they shall pass through into Christ's fellowship. And as an ineffable mystery, they shall learn in their own existence who Jesus is. Do you like that quote?
I love that quote. It's such a great quote, and I think it's the piece to me about, whether it's a book or a text or a Jesus, a static, dead, unmoving Jesus isn't what we're looking for, whether it's in the book or anything else. And what Schweitzer is saying, and I love this piece that he's a doctor, and every time I think about Albert Schweitzer, I think about, and I don't know if you all are familiar with him, he passed away not too many years ago, but it's Paul Farmer, who was the founder of Partners in Health, and it was really his Christian faith too that led him to do this. He was very interested in what justice meant, and I think about, the Matthew verses about, when did you feed me? When did you visit me in prison? Et cetera, et cetera. And when you've done this to the least of these or anyone in these circumstances, or if we find ourselves in these circumstances, that these are the places that we actually encounter Jesus. And it's a living, moving, dynamic presence and not something that's just relegated to a static past. And it's one of the things that I just love about Schweitzer and the way that he, while he's part of kind of this first search for the historical Jesus, but while he's doing this, that he really, he has this dynamic relationship with who Jesus is and these ideas. And I just think it's such a wonderful template for us who are trying to think about what it means to be doing historical Jesus work today.
I like highlighting that, and again, we're about to dive into some deep history that's fascinating right now, but I like highlighting that for all of us. If I had, and I won't go into detail, when I was in college, I got really into the Jesus seminar and trying to figure out historically what happened. And it was probably due to my own limitations. It was kind of a depressing 2 years because I couldn't figure it out, and I deeply appreciate all of it, or you would not be here. But just because we can't all understand it all intellectually doesn't mean that we can't follow Christ and keep going. And I think that's a part of what Schweitzer's, that the making of meaning is possible every day, every breath. But back to history. Tell us about, if you will, the Nag Hammadi discovery in Egypt.
Yeah, so Nag Hammadi, what do I want to say about Nag Hammadi? So Nag Hammadi in Egypt is, it's the upper Nile, so you go south from Alexandria, and it's in the middle of the desert, and it was this discovery of, this is kind of I call this an apocryphal story about this because we don't really know how accurate it is, but the story kind of goes, is that these farmers were digging for fertilizer and came across these jars, and they opened the jars, one of the stories goes that their mother threw one of the books on the fire for fuel, and then they realized that they might have something that was, they might have something that might be worth some money. And so eventually these books end up on the antiquities market, and what we have left it's 52 texts, and they seem to be related to, although this is, now there's other people asking these questions about if they were buried as kind of funerary objects, but most people think they were associated with the Pachomian monastery there, so one of the earliest monasteries in Christianity. And one of the hunches about this is that, so after canonization, or that certain texts are authorized, others are not, there were a lot of book burnings and destruction of books going on at the time, and that it's possible that they were hidden in these jars to try and preserve them, and then they kind of get lost to history. And it's a very wide variety of texts. Some of the texts we scholars had known about from early church historians who mostly were speaking against them.
Yeah.
And then we had things like, then there were texts that we didn't know anything about, we'd never heard of before. And then there was a piece of Plato's Republic in it as well. So they're reading philosophical tomes alongside kind of religious texts. And we know that this is something that's been going on for hundreds of years at this point in Alexandria, not only with kind of Christians, but Jews in Alexandria are reading philosophical texts alongside the Hebrew scriptures.
Can you say a word about the different types of genres within that discovery? Or is that a...
So the reason why I'm pausing is if you read about, I'm going to use these words and I'm going to use big scare quotes about this. If you read about this thing called Gnosticism that's associated with Nag Hammadi, and maybe I'll say more about this and maybe I won't. It's these categories that scholars have really come up with to try and put things in boxes. And so I really dislike the boxes. I think we box things in too much, and we've kind of read through the lens of the boxes rather than actually looking at the text. But there are things that call themselves gospels. There are things that call themselves treatises. We have everything from poetry and prayer to some stories, but lots of dialogues with people.
Yeah. So one of the texts in there is the Gospel of Thomas. So had the Gospel of Thomas been missing for I mean that's a long time, like 1700 years.
Yes.
That's amazing. Yeah. So there's this Gospel of Thomas that didn't make it in the New Testament. You follow me? Right? Because we've just got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We don't have Thomas or some of the others. And so Gospel of Thomas is in there. And I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on Thomas. I doubt any of you will remember this, but in a sermon a couple of months ago, we were looking at the parable of the leaven. And it was probably end of summer because we're in Matthew's Gospel. And Thomas is the one that I referenced because Thomas has his own version of the parable of the leaven. And it really is not the parable of the leaven, it's the parable of the woman. So it's a totally different subject in one sense. And the leaven shifts a little bit into the background, sort of. But this is what Thomas says. This is Thomas's version of the parable, so to speak. Jesus said, "The kingdom of the Father is like a certain woman. She took a little leaven, concealed it in some dough, and made it into large loaves. Let him who has ears hear." Tell us about, if you will, Gospel of Thomas.
So the Gospel of Thomas it's 114 sayings of Jesus, and it basically just starts out, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. And we think that some of the sayings there might actually be in the earliest layers of the Jesus movement. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that, we don't have, a lot of times in the Gospels, in the canonical Gospels, we get these we get all this interpretation
Right.
around, like, kind of pinning down what the parables mean. And I and other scholars, so I'm not the one who came up with this, but I definitely think that the parables are kind of supposed to make your brain kind of go, ugh.
Yeah.
And that when we learn what they mean, your brain kind of can't get into that cognitively dissonant space that I think parables are supposed to open up. And then some of them are later. We know that some of them probably aren't things that Jesus said. But one of the things that's really interesting about it is there seems to be, and you don't see this as much in the English, but in the Coptic, that there's this cascade where one word so you get one saying, and there's a word in that saying that's then in the next saying, and there's one word from the next saying that's in the next saying. This is the first time that I had done this, but in class this semester, I actually asked my students if anybody had seen the movie Pitch Perfect. Have any of you seen the movie Pitch Perfect? Yes, I'm so glad some of you have seen this. So there's this wonderful scene where all these a cappella kids are hanging out in like an empty pool, and they're playing this game where somebody's singing a song, and then they get to a word, and one other group picks up that word and sings another song based on that. And that's kind of what I wonder about the Gospel of Thomas. If this was like a game for people, like how fun, like let's tell the sayings of Jesus. Let's see who knows how many sayings of Jesus. But there's a catch. The saying that you come up with has to have a word that's in the saying that the person just gave. And so that it's kind of this game, but also this mnemonic technique. So how can we remember these really precious and important stories and sayings of this person that we revere?
Let's stick with parables just a minute more. That's really a great analogy with Pitch Perfect. We've got I'm not going to preach on it today, but we've got another parable from Matthew in today's gospel. It's the one about the talents, and it's really long. There's also a debate among historians about whether or not Jesus interpreted his own parables. So in other words, did Jesus just tell them straight, like the kingdom of the Father is like a woman who took leaven and hid it, and then not interpret it for you? Why? Because you're supposed to interpret it, right? It's the dance of interpretation occurs between us and Jesus. But there's some examples in Matthew, Mark, and Luke where Jesus then gives the parable and then tells you what it means, which is kind of boring and distracting sometimes. What's your take on? Do you have an opinion on that?
This is always the controversial part. And I should say, it's so funny that I'm a member of the Jesus Seminar, and in certain ways I don't really care about the historical Jesus so much.
Right.
But this piece where I do think these are later folks trying to pin down the meaning because they need it to mean a certain thing for X, Y, or Z reason. And I think there's all kinds of things that we could say about what those possible reasons might be. But I do think, and we don't do a good job of this as historians. I also think a lot of times we want to think about Jesus as a stand-up comic. Like he is funny, and we are just so out of context. We do not understand how funny he is.
Yeah, like when he says we're like sheep, I don't know that that's a compliment, and it's actually quite hilarious, right?
Exactly. Or and this word kingdom, which I probably would translate as empire, because it's really this contrast with the Roman Empire. I mean, think about the ancient world, the empire of God is like a woman who bakes bread with leaven, which is actually like a mold sometimes that people get from the corner. It's like a woman who bakes all this bread with the mold from her house. I mean, isn't this hysterical? I think it's funny. And we don't get the punchline.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It's like when people say, you explain the joke and the joke goes away. Why would he explain the parable?
Yeah. So we'll look at another text that was found at Nag Hammadi in just a minute, but why don't you say a word about, because it's so interesting, about the Jesus Seminar and your relationship to it, and kind of the humor in that. Yes, I mean, this is hugely influential on you. You are a scholar of the Jesus Seminar, and yet you like the Albert Schweitzer quote. Do you mind saying a little bit more about the Jesus Seminar?
Yeah, so the Jesus Seminar really was this product of the 1980s. And I think it's really important to understand the context around, what was going on with the rise of the religious right at that point. And Bob Funk, who founded the Jesus Seminar, was really interested in religious literacy, like people actually reading their Bibles and knowing what was there. But they decided to do what I and many other people who are a part of, we really refer to it as the Westar Institute now, so this kind of larger body of scholars who are doing work. They decided to do this thing where they had different beads, and then they voted on the authenticity.
Yes.
The red beads and the black beads. It was by color. And then they made this, and it actually has some really interesting information.
The color, if you'll say the color was associated with if it were historical or not.
If it were historical or not. So red, so it was based on, do y'all remember those red letter Bibles that all the words of Jesus were in red? So they ended up, by their voting with the beads, having so if you get the 5 Gospels, there's red and pink and gray and black. So you get all these different colors which lets you know kind of what people in the seminar thought about the authenticity. I have to say, my generation of scholars has made all kinds of jokes like, can we get some rainbow marbles and just randomly vote with them on things? Are there other things that we could do with this? Because we think it's we don't really think it's the right question anymore. And so, one thing that I will actually plug, because some of you might be interested in this, I am now working with several friends of mine from Union Theological Seminary, people who I graduated with, who are a part of the Poor People's Campaign with Reverend Barber. And Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris is a friend of mine. And we're in about probably 6 months to a year of discernment on this, but we're actually starting a new seminar with Westar on idolatry and power, and bringing together scholars and activists and other folks to kind of look at some of the major things that are going on, some of the major ways maybe in which the Bible has been weaponized, and going in both to look at the history of interpretation, and thinking about historically about, what are the ethics of actually using the Bible in these ways. So for those of you interested, Westar Institute, keep your eyes open.
So we'll have to have you back. That'll be so much fun to talk about all that.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, so back to Nag Hammadi. One of the other texts that was discovered is something called the Thunder Perfect Mind. And Celene is one of the editors and translators, is that fair to say, of this text. And this was published a few years ago, and it's still available online. And tell us real quickly, how would you categorize what this text is? Because it's so not the gospel according to Thomas. And then I'm going to give an example from this text that was in this library and see what you think of it.
So it is, so this is probably, our guess is it's what's called an eritology. And this is just a fancy word.
But it's a what?
Eritology.
Okay.
So this is an ancient genre. And basically, it's deities that have all of these I am sayings talking about how awesome they are. And so we get this a lot. So it's not just we get this in Judaism with things like, in Proverbs, where Sophia or wisdom has all of these I am sayings. We get this with Jesus in the Gospel of John. I am the bread of life. I am, I am, I am. We get this with people, with goddesses from Egypt, like Isis, and where she talks about, and it really is I am the one who brought civilization to the world. I am the one who brought the laws. I am in charge of the fact that women, birth babies in the 10th month. So it's these really big kind of lofty I am sayings that come from different deities in the ancient world. So it's a whole genre. They're kind of like poems, but it's really these I am sayings of deities. Yeah.
All right, so this is, I'm going to give two of these. One is on an I am saying, I am what anyone can hear but no one can say.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
No.
It was meant to be humorous. So it's this incredible paradox. And there's a lot of paradox in this text. All right, the second one is, since you're not going to talk about that one, I'll just move on. The second one, which is really, I picked it because it flows kind of naturally from the parable that we looked at. This one is and you can retranslate it, but I am the one who prepares the bread and my mind within. And here's what the footnote says in Dr. Lillie's book, that it's basically comparing the bread, the mind, to being like leaven. That we need the leaven in the body, which is the role of the mind, in order to rise. You're not going to talk about that one either?
I mean, isn't that the whole thing? Like, we're supposed to hang out with this. I have to say, I think that saying is towards the end of the poem.
It is literally the end.
Yeah, so we think this end, by the way, which is interesting, was tacked on later to actually domesticate the rest of the poem.
Oh my gosh, so I picked the domestication?
And we think that might be one of these things where they try and kind of bring this deity. We wonder, like, in line with Jesus in some ways, if that's one of the reasons why there might be these bread metaphors. There's lots of bread metaphors too. I don't know if anybody talked about this with the piece on the leaven, but Amy Jill Levine.
Yeah, that's where I got it from, actually.
She's so awesome.
Yeah.
And that short story is by Jesus, and
it's
her
amazing.
essay on the parable of the leaven is amazing.
Yeah, no, and I referenced it in that homily. And truly, if you want to go deeper on the parables, there's probably not a better book.
It's awesome.
She's at Vanderbilt, professor of Jewish studies, and it's great. Short stories by Jesus. Real quick, and then we'll move on to my last three questions. Partly, you're as a historian, as a scholar, you're a big advocate, rightly, for just we can't read the New Testament in isolation from all these texts, and not just all these texts, from a world of philosophical thought that is in the air. The New Testament's not just born out of nowhere. Is that a part of your point as a scholar? It doesn't come from nowhere. It is responding to so many things that's going on in its world at the time. And I only think for me that enriches what was happening then and makes these two-dimensional characters really into three-dimensional human beings, which is one of the things I think we want to do in our contemporary lives too. Yes. How do we make people, how do we really contact the humanness within ourselves and others? And I think it does, I said this last week, for me, the other thing about this is that it really helps me investigate my own contemporary positionality vis-a-vis Jesus. Like, am I Jesus and the disciples, or am I the centurion? Am I the Roman Empire? Like, who am I in this story? And then how can I think about that in terms of my faith more expansively? So let's shift, and then at the end we'll get to Q&A with all of you. So the shift is thinking about, and I'm sure several of us in this room have read Elaine Pagel's Gnostic Gospels. And Elaine Pagel actually has I don't know if Dr. Pagel is an Episcopalian. She certainly has a profound relationship with the Episcopal Church. Dr. Pagel's husband, who was a physicist, was actually buried out of Christ Episcopal Church in Aspen, and they've spent a lot of time in Aspen. And she writes quite movingly about that and her relationship with the Episcopal Church. You've got people like Dr. Pagels, people like my New Testament professor, who are huge advocates for reading stuff that's in and outside of the canon, just like you. But then you've got some Anglicans, Episcopalians, and one of the most famous is Rowan Williams, who's a scholar that I usually love, and probably the most well-written Archbishop of Canterbury, going all the way back until Thomas Cranmer, an incredible scholar. But Williams and some other Episcopalians, Anglicans, have real reservations about some of these texts, and their main argument, their main reservation is founded on, they say that a lot of these texts really are overly mythological and juxtapose basically spirit and enlightenment and flesh and history. And you rightly disagree with that. And what we need to say is that dynamic that Williams and some scholars complain about is absolutely present in the New Testament as well. Like, we've got moments in the New Testament where spirit and flesh seem to be juxtaposed. So how could you be hard on those texts when you're not similarly hard on the New Testament? Tell us about this debate, because it'll interest some of us in the room, if not all of us.
So the first thing I just want to say is I don't fault people like Williams or other folks who fall into this, who kind of perpetuate these ideas. They're long-standing, they're based starting in the 2nd century, and this is the way that people were trained. Even things like the translations of these texts help us interpret that way. And so it's one of the reasons why I decided I had to learn Coptic, because I was like, I don't trust any of these translations. And I think it's paid off. So one of the things that I think is going on is that, so one of the mythological texts that they talk about, and this would be a thing for another day, and I don't want to get too into it because it's about sexual violence, and I always like to give people a lot of time to know that this is what I'll be talking about before I actually say very much about this. But so it's a retelling of the Adam and Eve story. And they talk about how mythological this is, how bifurcated it is, how dualistic it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I've been thinking about with some of these texts that seem to be more dualistic around this, and even some of the New Testament texts, so going back to dating of the New Testament, if the New Testament texts are starting to be written around 70 CE, this is during the destruction and sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. These are people who are traumatized. These are folks that, whether or not they are experiencing firsthand Roman imperial violence, it is in the air and the ether. One of the things that we know from contemporary trauma theory is that part of the way in which the human psyche protects itself is by this splitting that happens. And I think when we look at these texts and then how they continue on, these are people who are very interested. The most mythological of these texts, the very last line of it, on the origin of the world, says, and they will know them by their deeds. So this is not about getting out of, I don't think it's about abandoning the material world. It's like the Gospel of John that says, we're not of this world, we're apart from it, because we're not interested in these dominant status quo paradigms that are about hierarchy and violence and harm. And so all of a sudden, when you read the text with that valence, you can see all of this other stuff happening. Another one is, I wish I had actually brought the quote with me, from the Gospel of Truth, where this author, this is another text from Nag Hammadi, uses Paul's hymn to love, and it's like one of the most beautiful visions that I've ever seen of like God made the sun flesh so that he could walk in the world as like, it's like the something of his heart and the fruit of his love.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It's absolutely stunning. And the whole text is about how you know God through the five senses. Yeah. So how is that anti-material? Like, how is that kind of abdicating the flesh? So but again, if you read older translations of it, you'd never know really what was happening.
Yeah, I'm curious, and we'll move on to our last two questions. If Elaine Pagels, I've never asked you this, if Elaine Pagels came to you and said, Dr. Lillie, I need to redo my book, you probably would counsel Dr. Pagels at Princeton University not to call it the Gnostic Gospels.
So you're going to totally laugh. So I have had the opportunity, because of talks that she's done in Boulder, to hang out with Dr. Pagels 2 times in the last handful of years. And she actually now publicly jokes if she had it to do again, she actually wouldn't call it the Gnostic Gospels from her own mouth.
Yeah.
She's like, it's too complicated. And this is really, again, bifurcated this conversation where Gnosticism becomes a stand-in for heresy. Yeah. And then all of a sudden we get orthodoxy and heresy that are mapped onto a world before they are actually existed. I just feel like I have to say this. So the other interesting thing, this word heresy comes from the Greek word heresis, which just meant sect. And it's the way that people talked about all these different philosophical schools in the ancient world. So it wasn't about one being right and one being wrong, but it was this multiplicity of different sects. And so then all of a sudden, this gets taken into to Christian ideology and theology in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, and becomes then, because all of those heresies are Greek and Roman philosophical schools. So they're all wrong. So then it becomes heresy as opposed to Christianity.
Fascinating. All right, let's shift, and then we'll get to Q&A. Let's do about 5 or 10 more minutes, though. I want to do 2 last questions. One, I want to talk about the way language works, and I'll just think for a minute. So I'm going to give a quick example and see what Dr. Lillie thinks about this. I think in the world we live in, you and I are we tend to associate certain types of language are acceptable in certain types of places. So for example, if I'm in the grocery store and I'm checking out and I say to the cashier, hey, on aisle 5, there was an angel, kind of blurry, who just said to me, do not be afraid. That's an odd thing to say to a cashier. But if you went from the cashier into the cathedral and Canon Katie Pearson is in the pulpit and goes, the angel says to Mary and to all of us, do not be afraid, that's not at all a weird thing to hear, right? You follow me? So say a word, like I don't know, I've got so many questions about this, but how do you, in these texts, both in the New Testament and in the discoveries at Nag Hammadi, they're not as cued into this is appropriate here and this is the type of language that's not appropriate there as much as we are. It's more fluid. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So, it's this really big difference in the ancient world that, we have all of these, these pieces of our life are siloed. We have religion over here and economics over here and politics over here. And and ethnicity over here. Those are all part and parcel of the same system in the ancient world. So,
which is why you get parables about leaven and bread and talents and emperors and all of that, right?
Right. There's no separation. And, even the emperors. So this is a great example of this. So, the thing where the story where Jesus is asked, to pay taxes, and he says, give me a coin, and he picks up the coin and says, whose image is on it? And the punchline is, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and God what is God's. Well, most of the time, this is kind of how I used to think about this too, and my students definitely are in this case where they're like, oh yeah, it's like the United States, the separation of church and state, like it's politics over here and religion over here, and I'm like, no, it's about what God you're loyal to. Are you loyal to the God of Israel, or are you loyal to the God of Rome, i.e. the emperor? And so there's a whole different thing that's happening in in the text, and they believe, it's one of my favorite, like ruach or pneuma. So this word that gets translated as spirit. It means breath, wind, and spirit at the same time. So this thing that enlivens us and is the thing that moves between us is about this like construct of things. I don't know. I usually ask this to the folks who are kind of half my age at this point. But did you all ever grow up having the thing where you were going past a cemetery and you had to hold your breath so the spirits didn't get in? Well, that's because breath, wind, and spirit are the same thing. So if you breathe it in, the spirit can come in. So this is like a contemporary example of the way that the ancient world has kind of creeped into our contemporary reality. But there just would have been you can totally see an angel on aisle 5. Exactly. No big deal, friends. You never know. Again, these stories of how Jesus shows up to the disciples at the end of the Gospels after the resurrection. We have all kinds of stories of gods and demigods from Rome and Greek who are showing up every day. They're disguised as other things. People don't recognize them right away. And this is just part and parcel of life. You never know who a God is, or you never know who Jesus is. So you're always kind of moving in relationship to this bigger, to your place in this bigger world.
Well, let's end with this question, and then we'll open up to the floor. I've long been fascinated by the fact that Paul does not tell any stories about Jesus. So let me sketch it really quickly. Paul talks a lot about the cross, a whole lot about resurrection, a fair amount about love in that passage that Dr. Lillie referenced earlier, 1 Corinthians 13. But there's no story of a healing. There's no story of walking on water. There's no story of being up on the mountain with Peter and James and John, Transfiguration. There are no stories. And that's probably for some of us what drives us crazy about Paul, right? He's a letter writer and kind of this theologian, but is not really a storyteller. Why? Do you have thoughts on why is that? Did Paul know the stories about Jesus and choose not to tell them? Or does he sort of predate all of that and didn't know them, and so his message becomes more of this existential reality of cross, resurrection, and anti-Roman sentiment?
So there's two things that I'd say about that. Even even with you, Richard, we don't know each other very well. Mm-hmm. We haven't known each other for a long time. But if I were to write you an email, I'm not going to say, Dear Richard, this is Celene Lillie from Longmont, Colorado, who teaches at, there's a context already.
Right.
If it's my mom, I'm not going to write her my whole biography while I'm sending her a text. She has all of that information. And so I think one of the questions we need to ask is what does Paul know that they already know? So it's not in a letter. Yeah. So I think that would be the first thing. The second thing,
that's really helpful. We're looking over people's mail that's not addressed to us.
Exactly. And only one side of the conversation. We don't even know what they asked for the most part. Yeah. We have Paul's side of a two-way conversation where there are clearly lots of other people, even at the beginning of, I think about 1 Corinthians, where he says, were you baptized into Apollos or Cephas or Paulos? No, you're baptized into Christ. And so they're familiar with a bunch of other teachers. So we can't really, know what they know. So I think that's one question that we need to ask. The other thing is, this is definitely kind of a lecture for another time, and I'm going to see if I can do this in a nutshell. So Paul begins in his, when he first kind of hears of the Jesus movement, he's persecuting them. We know this from his own mouth, and something shifts for him. He has some kind of revelation, an apocalypse, an unveiling. He has an epiphany, and something changes in the way that he sees things. And one of the things that I really think is going on is that, so this word we translate as Gentiles is really just the word for nations. And so Paul initially thinks, we're Jews or Hebrews and they're Gentiles. And when we get these maps of Rome, so these visual maps of Rome, they have all of these kind of nations that are personified as women. And guess what? Judeans are there too. They're not separate. So it's weird. So when you read the translation of the inscription, if they translated it how we would, it would be the Judeans of the Gentiles. Right. So I think there's something where Paul realizes that under Rome, we're all in the same boat. And rather than this divide and conquer mentality, pitting ethnicities and different peoples against one another, he's like, okay, so instead of the God of the empire, we can all come under the God of Israel. And I do think it's based on things like Micah 4 with, the beating the swords into plowshares. And then it says, and each nation will come and yet be under its own vine and fig tree. So that it's not about converting to Judaism, but it's a way to be together on the same mountain with one another. And so I think as he's moving away from Judea, moving away from areas, many of these areas do have synagogues there, but some of them don't. And so finding also, everybody knows what crucifixion looks like. Yep. And what does it mean for a God to be with the crucified rather than with the one who crucifies? And so this, I think, no matter what stories are there, this is the piece he goes to again and again. And then the thing that shows up in 3 letters, and I don't know why people miss this so much, but it is, what's the greatest commandment? To love your neighbor as yourself. And so this is also very clearly a central part of the Jesus program based on Leviticus 19. And so again, so as Paul is a Pharisee, bringing that central message of Jesus, you see it in Romans, you see it in Corinthians, and you see it in Galatians.
Outstanding. Okay, let's open up for questions. Raise your hand. Mary will come to you. Please do say your name and then your question.
I'm John Leuchter, and this has been bothering me for about a year when I saw a quote in one of Bart Ehrman's books about women being incomplete men in the ancient world. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So they have this really weird one-sex model in the ancient world. And I just want to say that there are definitely texts that are pushing up against this. But it's really terrible and stereotypical for the most part. So it's like the 3 bears, women are too frigid. Men are at the right temperature. And so women are a little too cold. And so our genitals stay up in our bodies. So for men, they drop down, and they believed that the uterus was kind of an inverted penis, and that the ovaries were testicles. And so because women are frigid, their genitals don't drop down outside of their bodies. So that's how they're an incomplete male. Who knew you would get an ancient anatomy lesson this morning?
Thank you for sharing with us. I'm interested in that early Jesus movement. In my eyes, that was a cult. What differentiates it from a cult?
And let me just say, keep raising your hand, even though one question's been asked. It'll just help Mary to keep moving at pace. So if you've got the next question, just raise your hand. She'll come to you. Yes.
So, oh goodness. So, was it a cult or not? Like everything was a cult then. So, I mean, I think that's the place where they are, in religious studies, we now call them new religious movements. And I kind of laugh about this, but people are doing this all the time in the ancient world, and it doesn't necessarily signify anything bad. I think the thing that I want to notice about any new religious movement, though, is that it can always go awry. And I remember that I was shocked with, do you all know who Jim Jones is? He's the Kool-Aid guy. So I did not realize this, but Jim Jones was a Disciples of Christ pastor and actually pastored the first racially integrated church in California. And then they got more and more kind of embattled against what's going on. And so I do, there are things I think that I think there are really great questions that we can ask in regard to what you're raising about, what did this religious movement look like? Was it a cult? How do we define cult? What were they asking people to do that was outside the norm? And I do think, too, that we have very narrow notions of what we find I dislike all of these words that I'm about to use, so I just want to give that big caveat. Crazy, mentally unstable, because our society has such rigid strictures. And so, people would think we were nuts if we started like some kind of new religious movement where everybody's heading up to Rocky Mountain National Park to like the headwaters of the Colorado River, and all of a sudden we're having this new like baptismal revival going on up there with tents and, I have no clue what else. Use your imaginations, like it could get wild. And so it's a really interesting question, but there were all kinds of mystery religions at the time, and several of the New Testament texts actually refer to it as a mystery. And so it connects with these ideas of these secret mystery religions that just were, again, part and parcel of the ancient world. So it's a different, it's a different worldview, really, that they have. But I think it's a great question to ask, because what it helps us do is reflect on certain things that Christianity is doing today.
Okay, I'm Ann Jones, and I guess maybe this isn't exactly a question. Well, I can phrase a question. How many of you have read Schweitzer's Quest for the Historical Jesus? Because if you haven't, it's right upstairs in the library. When you first walk in the door of the library right now, if you look straight ahead, there are probably 8 or 10 books on display with the Quest for the Historical Jesus, and his Schweitzer book is there as well. So it's another ad for the library, just right up the stairs, and thank you.
And thank you. We've got time for one or two more.
I've got a quick one. What are the Gospels that you think should have made it into the canon and didn't? You said you had 2 favorite ones.
I love the Gospel of Thomas, and I love the Gospel of Mary. I also really like the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of James. There's a whole bunch of them that I actually think have some really interesting things. And I just have to say, one of the reasons why I love reading them is that it shakes up, for me, reading the New Testament itself. There's a lot of weird stuff in the New Testament that, because we're used to those texts, it seems normal and everyday, like the Transfiguration, for example. That's really weird, y'all. But it seems really normal because it's part of our worldview. It's part of our, it's part and parcel of the way that many of us grew up. And so looking at these other texts, whether we like what's there or not, I think helps shake up the ways that we view the canon too.
Last question.
What books? I'm Gordon Brooks. So what books in the New Testament that were accepted or not that you'd think don't belong there?
Oh, what book? I was going to say, I like most of them, but I really could do without I could do without the pastorals. Like, get rid of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Those texts where, and we don't think Paul actually wrote them, just to say, it moves from this like ecclesia horizontal model of Greek democracy to the Roman patriarchal household. And I just think they've been used to justify all kinds of hierarchies, for the last 2,000 years, whether it is subordination of women, enslavement. And the reason why I bring these up is that these, to me, once you start to break those open, all of a sudden there's a different kind of inclusion on every level imaginable once we kind of hit these highlights of gender and what ends up becoming kind of racialization around enslavement. So I would love if those kind of, and people are still using them to justify some really, really, really horrible, demeaning, dehumanizing things. I also have to say, just really quickly, I wish that we did better translations of what have been considered the sexual sin lists in the New Testament. If people realized that these were all about power dynamics and really kind of violent power dynamics, we wouldn't read them in ways that somehow think that they're talking about like mutual loving relationships between partners, that we've missed the power dynamic that's happening in these. So I'd like better translations on pretty much everything.
So last question, will you please come back again?
Absolutely. And I just want to give one plug really quickly for people who are interested in historical Jesus stuff. Westar is in the middle of doing this series right now. They've just had one with John Dominic Crossan. He's turning 90 this year, and all of these are free. So you can sign up, and they are free. They're 2-hour conversations with scholars. I'm actually doing the one in, I think it's January 24th, which I need to get on top of, but we'll be talking about Jesus and nonviolence that night. But just so if people are interested, this is a really great free way to engage in historical Jesus stuff.
That's wonderful. Dr. Lillie, truly, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you. Join me in thanking Celene. Thanks for joining us. And if you're online, Holy Eucharist begins at 10.